You're listening to Edge of Faith, a multimedia magazine where we discuss art and culture through a Christian lens. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm kind of, puzzled by this unusual time we're in with the coronavirus and trying to navigate that along with everybody else. So, but it seems to be quite timely to be thinking about the topic of crisis and the topic subject of my new book. So I'm glad for the opportunity on launch day, actually today, it comes out today, to talk with you about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you begin the book with discussing our culture's media overload of crisis, probably apathy and cognitive dissonance as well. Perhaps you could start with something simple like telling us what you meant by the title of Our Good Crisis.
Yeah, it's a double entendre, so the one meaning is there is a crisis of good, an absence of good in our culture. The historian Philip Jenkins has traced kind of recent history from 2000 to the present, and he made the observation that the scale and speed of change in our culture has no precedent, and that it's going to take years to kind of assess the impact of that rapid change, technological, moral, government, politics, and now we can add to it, the coronavirus. So we find ourselves in a kind of unprecedented time. It's not that there hasn't been crisis in our country. We've certainly seen great upheaval in the 60s and 70s. But the scope and the speed, kind of the density of change is unprecedented in the U.S. And so it has produced a lot of kind of shifts in sexuality, morality, public discourse, politics. And in it, we see a kind of a lot of acrimony, a lot of despair. So there's a crisis of the good, of moral goodness. At the same time, it's for a Christian, I think it should be a good crisis. In other words, what can we make out of the crisis? Well, we can make good, and that comes out of Jesus' robust moral vision for life in the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount. It's a calling for us as Christians to seek the flourishing of our communities, to love our neighbor as ourselves. So while there is considerable change and shift, it's also a remarkable opportunity for the church to really dig into the roots and depths of our faith and to live out this fruitful moral vision that Jesus has for us in the world.
Right, absolutely. The full title, Overcoming Moral Chaos with the Beatitudes, Our Good Crisis, and as you already started to touch on the Beatitudes, which of course teach us true moral and ethical stance in this world. But maybe you could lay out a little more of your thoughts on that and how the book focuses on these principles and how that could help our culture and even the individual today.
Yeah, absolutely. We wake up to a crisis every day. That's probably more acute than ever, given the last couple weeks. And so if we're scrolling through our feed, we'll see any number of crises: financial crisis, stock market plummet, sex scandal, a health crisis. And we get quite opinionated about them. We can be really down in the dumps or up in the arms. And if we were scrolling along and we saw, breaking news, global moral crisis, we would probably just keep scrolling. And yet behind most crises is a profound moral crisis. So the Me Too sex crisis that we're troubled by is driven by a moral brokenness, by lust, financial crisis, greed, political crisis, power. The coronavirus is not particularly moral in nature, but it does raise a lot of moral questions. Will you look out for number one? Will you buy groceries for 2, 3 times the amount you need, or will you leave some for others? So even with a health crisis, there is moral opportunity. So as we think about this kind of culture of crisis that we find ourselves in the book, I try to take each of the Beatitudes and examine how do we really respond to crisis. What's our functional, I kind of call them secular Beatitudes that we often live by, and how do those compare and contrast with Jesus' Beatitudes? So, for instance, what does it look like to be poor in spirit in the age of a big need? Or what does it look like to mourn, which we certainly need to be doing, in an age of distraction? How do you deal with mourning when there is so much to distract yourself with? How do you really cope and persevere in suffering as it's easy to kind of minimize your suffering through digital escape? So I'm trying to take each of the Beatitudes and examine the ancient wisdom of Jesus for kind of these various kind of secular Beatitudes that we find ourselves in.
Secular Beatitudes. I don't even like the sound of that. So, this issue of EOF is on spirituality and the mystical side of Christianity. Could you share how you feel the Beatitudes could help the Christian today to develop some of those attributes?
Yeah, the book wasn't written with that angle, but
Right.
you can't escape, the mystical or the spiritual at all from the Beatitudes. We often think of them as kind of punchy moral statements, and they're quite flattening. I mean, you get 2 or 3 in, and you're kind of like, I'm out. Like, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. It's like, man, I can't get past number one. And yet, each of them are kind of paired with this, remarkable, transcendent promise that yours is the kingdom of heaven, that you would see God. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. I mean, you can't get more spiritual than that. Seeing God. And so, what we need to do is we think about these kind of eschatological promises that are attached to each of the moral requirements, is the beauty and the grandeur of those. So it's not as if, let's take blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. It's not as if it's saying you always have to be pure in heart, and if you're not, you never get to see God. It's not kind of an equation. It's not a spiritual equation. It says blessed. So there's blessing, flourishing, happiness for those that have a pure heart. For they shall see God. The promise is through Christ's perfect life, death, resurrection. It's kind of brought into the present. It's inaugurated. We can enjoy that promise now. So seeing God motivates me to be pure. I think there's a dynamic there that I get to see God because of Christ. The knowledge of the glory of God shines in the face of Jesus Christ, Paul tells us. And so what would it look like to so see God that you would want to be pure? I think of my times in the morning where I meditate on the scriptures and pray. My goal in those times is to see God. It is to get a glimpse of His truth, His beauty, His grandeur, His omnipotence. This morning I was in Psalm 139, and as I moved through Psalm 139, I was struck by His intimate knowledge of me, that He knows a word before I speak. I was struck by His presence with me. So it's not just that He knows things about me, but that He's with me. So God is kind of omniscience, has an omniscience about me. And then He has a presence. You can ascend to the heights of heaven. You can descend to the depths of Sheol. You can take the wings of the dawn or dwell in the innermost part of the sea, and there I will be with you. So He's not just omniscient about me in kind of an armchair way. He's present with me and through the Holy Spirit everywhere I go, even to the depths of Sheol, which is quite comforting as we think about kind of the economic chaos, people dying at quite a clip in Italy, kind of just the anxiety of suffering and death that we contemplate with the coronavirus, that, even if we go to the depths of Sheol, I will be with you. And he even says, I'll take you by the hand and I'll lead you. I mean, so God doesn't just know everything about me. He's present with me wherever I go. These are mystical, remarkable, lofty things. And so as I spent time thinking about that and thinking about how do I respond to all this as a pastor, as a father, I was so comforted that God knows all of this about me and all of kind of the emotional turmoil that I'm facing, that we're facing. But he just isn't kind of in an armchair knowing about me. He's present with us. He's present with me. He'll take me by the hand and lead me through all this and show me how to flourish in the midst of a lot of confusion. And so I got a glimpse of his personal omniscience and his personal presence with me. And so I'll take that with me today. And as I take that with me, and I might hit an opportunity when I'm frustrated or tempted to despair or be angry, I'll pull that out. It's like a little snapshot of God that I had this morning when I saw him. And I'll pull that out and remind myself that he is with me wherever I go, that he knows a word before it's spoken. And that will encourage me to respond in a pure way, not an impure way to those opponents. So it's kind of like, I see devotions as kind of like, opportunities to get snapshots, vistas of God's glory and magnificence, and then to take those with me throughout the day. And when I'm tempted to pull them out and to kind of be realigned to enjoy the personal omnipotence and the personal omnipresence, the personal knowledge of me. So, that's just one example of, the way that the Beatitudes have a profound spiritual dynamic that is really gritty and earthy, and it has, traction in our everyday.
Yeah, really. I'll have to say I'm gonna remember that analogy of a snapshot. Instead of us always pulling our smartphones out and looking at a selfie or what food we ate for lunch, we could pull that mental smartphone out and look at the images and pictures of God that we've put in our minds from meditating. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, if the listener were only able to take one thing away from our good crisis, what would you want that to be?
Man, that's a tough question. There's just, I think, so much that was personally helpful and then just immediately relevant. I think, if you just boil it down to one thing, it would be kind of embedded in the second chapter, which meditates on blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This idea of being poor in spirit is something that nobody conquers or graduates from, and yet it is immediately relevant and life-giving every day. The question is, what does it mean? And so you have Jesus give a similar sermon in the Gospel of Luke. I take the text from the Gospel of Matthew. And in the Gospel of Luke, he says, blessed are the poor. There's no in spirit prepositional phrase. And so what does he mean? Does he mean God just blesses only the economically poor, those humbled by circumstance? Well, there is the qualifier in Matthew that it's in spirit. So it seems to me that what does it mean to be poor in spirit? There is some kind of circumstantial humbling. It might be because you're economically poor. It might be because you're generous and you're willing to part with things. You have a compassion for the marginalized and poor. I think that those meanings are in that phrase, poor in spirit, but I don't think that that's exclusively what they mean, or the in spirit would be there. So I would say a person who's poor in spirit is going to be generous, in touch with those that are in need, toilet paper, groceries, or worse. But it's also a person who has a profound sense of their need and dependence on God. They're poor in spirit. They don't compare themselves to everyone else to kind of assess, hey, how am I cutting it? Do I have worth? But they look up. They look up at God, and when when we look at God's outstretched greatness and glory, we cannot help but be humbled that he is the creator of all things, that his glory is unimpeachable and has existed from eternity past without us. And when we compare ourselves to something great, we're humbled and we're lifted all at once. I think about my trip to the Grand Canyon with my family a few spring breaks ago. As I looked down the miles, along the miles of the canyon and the stretches of rock, it was so humbling, but so thrilling at the same time. It was a kind of an awe that crept over my soul, and yet I am so tiny.
Right.
I am so small. And when we really get our eyes off of other people and circumstances, and we look at the grandeur of God, that's what happens. It's this kind of flattening and lifting dynamic that is so enriching to our souls and produces a kind of meekness as we relate to other people. And I pray that every day. I say, Lord, make me poor in spirit. I have the kingdom of heaven. Who am I to stockpile? Who am I to magnify myself? So I think if one thing to walk away with was to fall in love with that beatitude and to pray it every day and to see it as such a blessing. That blessed are the poor, happy are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
Wonderful. That does really kind of sum up the book as well, is that our culture is so overwhelmed with all of these media crises, or some of them are crisis, but it's a distraction to keep us from understanding where we are in the universe and with God, and it makes us too inflated and self-important, which is, I guess, where sin comes from, right?
Right.
So, as I read the book, I could see that you spent a lot of time researching, and you were very thoughtful in your delivery. Perhaps you could share with us what was one of the biggest revelations to you as you wrote this book, and something that really stood out as you were, researching.
I think one of the things that stood out the most was my time of thinking and researching on peacemaking in an age of outrage. That blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And I thought about, the challenge of making peace in an age in which there are really kind of two extremes. There's a culture of outrage where we see anything that we don't like, how the president handles something, or some kind of comment on social media, or some kind of political stance, and there's just an eruption of judgment, condemnation, anger. So there's a culture of outrage, and social psychologists Jonathan Haidt and Luciana, so his co-author, wrote a book where they explore kind of the irrational extremes of the culture of outrage, which were, quite insightful. They talk about a culture of harm. So in universities across the nation, speakers are being rejected, professors are being, forced to resign because students find their teaching, quote, harmful. Now, this is just education. This is the, liberal education is the exposure to ideas that you disagree with in order to become educated. Right. And students are now saying, I find those ideas personally harmful. And so what you have in that is a culture of fragility, that the people have become so fragile that they can't even entertain an idea that they disagree with or that they dislike. And yet the hallmark of liberal education is entertaining things that we disagree with, and even to sharpen and mature and to recognize we haven't arrived and we need to look at different viewpoints. So it's interesting, this culture of outrage is also expressed in these students as they have, accosted professors. I include a number of the stories in the book, called for their resignation, called them names, blasted things that were untrue about them on social media, and gone to their homes, threatened them. I mean, just awful, extreme stuff, outrage. And at the same time, it's coming from a place of profound fragility. That's kind of the two extremes that we find ourselves in. And so it presents a real opportunity for the church to be a third way, to be a people that make peace with one another. Don't not pretend like there's not conflict, but to enter into the conflict and to really seek the peace and reconciliation between one another. So I guess one of the things that was insightful was, just thinking about these extremes and how difficult and yet how unique it would be for Christians to be peacemakers, to be people that are charitable, that don't judge motives, that give people the benefit of the doubt, and yet are willing to have difficult conversations in which they may be wrong or the other person may be wrong or right. What was particularly striking as I thought about this, I kind of did a mental Rolodex. I kind of thought about who are the peacemakers in my life. And it was very hard for me to come up with people that I knew who really embodied the vision of Jesus as peacemakers. There are a lot of people that are kind of peacekeepers, like let's not have conflict. But that's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is talking about let's come to the table with the genuine grievances, but work through it in order to reconcile. And so that was one of the shocking things as I was thinking through that. I was thinking about myself, like, how good am I at this? Am I a peacemaker? So I guess what was insightful was kind of where we are as a society. Culture of fragility, culture of outrage, and then the shocking kind of observation that, man, I don't know a lot of people that like embody this in a way that's I would say go learn from that person. And so that, I guess that raised a question for me is why. And as I thought about it, it seemed to me that there are two approaches to relationships. One is in this relationship, what matters most to me is the social connection, not the person. So if you gossip about me, I might talk to you about it, but if you kind of blow it off or make an excuse, I'm not going to press you, because what I care about is not you. I care about the social acceptance you give me. And if I disappoint you or I anger you by confronting you with your sin, I might lose that social acceptance. So that's one approach to relationship that keep us from getting to the far side of peace. And so we just kind of have this tacit agreement to kind of maintain and improve everyone's idols and sin. The other is in the relationship is I want to be right no matter what. I don't really care about you as a person. The relationship come and go. What matters most is that you hear my viewpoint, you agree with my viewpoint, and if you don't, at least I just pulverize you with my arguments. I mean, so those are two kind of primary ways that we relate to one another. One is I value being right more than the relationship, and the other is I value the relationship more than the person. And there's no way to reach real peace if that's our default approach to relationships. Peace comes from a deep-seated confidence in who we are in Christ and how loved and accepted we are by Him that frees us to be wrong, not be right, and also compels us to explore and challenge one another, even if we might be socially rejected or snubbed, because we are enjoying the peace of Christ ourselves that rules our heart. So it's kind of a long answer, but you did ask me what was what jumped out at what was the biggest revelation. So thanks for kind of putting up with that long answer.
Sure. That peacekeeper, that's a rough one today for sure. Things are so vitriolic and divisive anymore. That's something I think about quite frequently as well. It is difficult to, confront someone with a different opinion, because it seems like, along with, like your media of crisis, people have so much of that just fed to them that they just have a talking point. So you're not really having a conversation. They're waiting for a pause so that they can attack, right? So So
Yeah.
I see your point. You have to have strength and really do those things. I think personally, what I've done frequently lately is, I agree with both sides on a lot of things because neither side's right. Um,
Hmm.
but when I find myself in agreement with someone, then I'll frequently try to correct them from some of the radicalization they have because it gets so extreme, and there's so much ad
Hmm.
hominem attacking, and I know that's not Christian, and I don't even think that's the human spirit. So if you could just get rid of the radicalization on everybody's side, I think you could get closer to the center, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But
Yeah, and I try to give some practical steps on how to do this in the book. And I appreciate your comments there, which I'm like, well, how do we actually do this? I kind of get just kind of a, first pray by yourself, but pray with the person that you're in conflict with. If you can't pray together, you're not ready to make peace.
hmm
And then second, to just evaluate yourself. We have a tendency to evaluate others.
right,
And so we're ready to break down their position and to really get along with God. The Psalm 139 begins and ends with searching your God. To evaluate ourselves before the face of God, forum Deo, and to ask Him to produce, repentance, insight, wisdom on where you might be wrong, and to bring that to the table first instead of what someone else has done wrong. If we can both come humbly, there's a real opportunity for peace. So, anyway, just some practical things to think about there.
right. And from the mystical side, if you're wanting to see God, and we're told that we're created in God's image, then I guess that means all of us. Thank you for both writing the book, Our Good Crisis, and for coming to talk to us about it today.
Yeah, well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for taking the time to listen and be interested.